Welcome to the Spiritually Minded Women podcast. If you're a woman who is ready and willing to be a follower of Jesus, you're in the right place. Join me as we dive in deep to learn how to embrace your journey on the covenant path with checkpoints instead of checklists. I'm your host, Darla Trindler, and I'm cheering you on. Welcome to your journey. Welcome to the Spiritually Minded Women podcast. This is Darla, and it has been a while since I've done a solo episode. And since I'm in the middle of batching interviews, I thought that this would be the perfect week to share some thoughts and give you an invitation at the end. So, a couple things before we dive into the episode. This week, I made the decision to step away from social media for a little while. I know this was the right decision for me right now, as I'm working on many things behind the scenes, but it was still a little bit hard. I know that I'll be back on social media at some point because I really enjoy posting and interacting there. And I feel like there is a space for me to share light. But for right now, I feel like I should take a break. Breaks are good. And I am hopeful that this break will re-energize me and help me to come back to social media with more light to share. So in the meantime, you can still find me on your podcast feed like you are right now. I will still be here releasing a new episode every Wednesday. And I also send out a weekly newsletter to my subscribers, just sharing a faith-filled message, just something that I've been thinking about or something related to that week's podcast episode. I am continuing to send that out during my break from social media. And I actually plan to share a little bit more in my weekly emails. So if you want to receive my email, just go to the link in the show notes to sign up. One more thing I want to share is that I have been a recent guest on two different podcasts. So last week, I was on the Parenting in Real Life podcast with Alexis and Alan Tanner. The episode's called 3 Tips for Navigating the Teenage Years. At the beginning, I share a funny story about being called out of the stands to coach one of my sons in wrestling. It's really funny. And you don't want to miss that or the tips that I gave about teenagers. And then this week, I was on the Pebbles of Light podcast with Ann Maxon. The episode is titled Helping Others Recognize Their Divine Potential. And I also talk in that episode a lot about raising teens. I really love Ann. She has become a great friend to me. She's also a great host. I love what she shares on her podcast. So again, I will put links in the show notes. You're going to find out this episode's going to have tons of links, but I would love to have you check out those two episodes, Parenting in Real Life and Pebbles of Light podcasts. Okay, so let's dive into the episode. I really like to take the prophet's words and study them, ponder them, and gain my own insights about what he has said. I have done this many times on the podcast. When I first started my podcast, can you believe it's been almost 4 years? I can't believe it's been that long, but it was in 2018. I broke down one paragraph from a quote from President Nelson's talk from the April 2018 General Conference, Revelation for the Church, Revelation for Our Lives, and made a 5-part series with worksheets called 5 Ways to Be More Spiritually Minded. And you can still access this series if you go to my website, spirituallymindedwomen.com, click on courses, and I'll link all that up in the show notes too. I also did an episode in March 2020 called Acting on the Prophet's Invitations at a Hinge Point in Church History, where I outlined invitations that President Nelson had extended since the previous conference in October 2019. I shared invitations from talks in General Conference as well as invitations he had extended on social media. And then in conjunction with this episode, I did another episode that was what I call a listener call-in show. So I had listeners call in and record a short message sharing the blessings they had seen from accepting the prophet's invitations. And then in May 2020, I actually gathered a group of women on Zoom to talk about how they hear the Savior in their life. And I did re-air that episode last week on the podcast. So you probably have recently heard that one. And if you're interested in any of the older episodes that I just mentioned, again, you can find the links in the show notes for this episode. And side note, someone recently asked me where the show notes can be found. Like you hear me say that a lot. It's in the show notes. So you can find the links in the description of the episode wherever you're listening. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, there's a description of this episode, and that's where all the links are. Or you can go to my website, spirituallymindedwomen.com, and click on podcast in the menu at the top, and that will take you to the show notes for the last 47 episodes. All of this to say that I have a track record of taking things that President Nelson has said and turning them into episodes that are usually episodes that involve you, which is my favorite. I wasn't really seeking to do another episode centered around the words of President Nelson, but the Spirit had other ideas. When I was watching the Sunday morning session of the October 2021 General Conference with my family, and President Nelson got up to speak and he started talking about temples, I turned to my husband at the other end of the couch and I said, "This is big." I felt the minute he started speaking that for me personally, this talk would be monumental. When he finished speaking, I looked at my family and I just said, wow. In the months since that conference, I have been studying this talk, which is called The Temple and Your Spiritual Foundation. I've listened to it a few times, but for me, the inspiration really comes when I read the talk and write my impressions as I read. Everything he said about covenants totally jumped out to me, and I have written lots of notes as a result of reading this talk many times since that conference. I think one of the reasons covenants were on my mind was because shortly before the October 2021 General Conference, where President Nelson gave this talk, I had interviewed Charla Gettle. The title of Charla's episode is Why Understanding Christ's Covenant Promise Gives You a Framework for Resilient Faith. So in that interview, Charla talked about what she had learned from studying Nephi's life about how parents can help youth have resilient faith. She has also written a book that we talked about in the interview called Spiritual Resilience, Leading Our Youth to Go and Do. It is an amazing book, and I highly recommend it for anyone. But Charla talked about, in that interview, the 5 covenants we make when we receive the endowment in the temple. And she totally opened my mind to think more about the covenants I had made and to gain better understanding. She said this in the interview: I'm able to recognize that our covenants have very specific rewards for us. They are a two-way promise. We make a promise, but there are some huge guarantees that are rewarded to us in return. And those guarantees give us the framework for a more resilient faith. I was so struck by Charla's thoughts about the way God keeps his promises to us when we covenant with him. She called them guarantees. Now, it is not always easy to find true guarantees in this life, but Charla pointed out that we can get them from God. Charla's interview really impacted me, and I was already studying about covenants and specifically the 5 covenants we make in the temple endowment before President Nelson gave his talk in General Conference. So fast forward to just a few weeks ago, I was in the car by myself going to an out-of-town wrestling tournament to watch my son. And I had an hour and a half of driving ahead of me. So I decided to switch on President Nelson's talk in the car and listen again. This time, as I listened, I felt a strong prompting that some of the things he said should be part of a podcast episode, and that I needed to pull women together again over Zoom to discuss the prophet's words. I try really hard to follow promptings, but if I'm being honest, and I am being honest, I hardly ever act the first time I hear the prompting. Can anybody relate to that? My husband likes to joke that whenever he brings something up with me, my initial answer is always no. I don't know why I do that, but it takes me some time to come around to a yes about anything. I am working on the habit with my husband, and I have totally seen how I do it a lot with the Lord as well. So I was driving and having this prompting, and then I was telling him all these things. I was saying, I can't do this again. The only reason the Hear Him episode worked was because it was the beginning of a pandemic. No one had anything else to do. We were all starved for interaction, so it was easy to get a group of women together over Zoom. Everyone is so much busier now. So these were all my excuses to the Lord. But as I continued to drive in silence, my initial no turned to an okay. And by the time I arrived at the tournament, my heart had softened enough that I was ready to give God a full yes. After the weekend, on Monday morning, I sat down to act on the prompting. I picked a date, set up the Zoom link and some other details, and sent the invitation to join me for a live group podcast recording to my email list. I continued to share on Instagram and on last week's episode. At the time of this recording, the slots are almost full and more women are signed up than the last time I did this. I am so excited to gather again and talk about how you would answer this question from President Nelson's talk. What does it mean to you to live inside your temple covenants? During President Nelson's remarks, he said this: and to each of you who has made temple covenants, I plead with you to seek prayerfully and consistently to understand temple covenants and ordinances. Spiritual doors will open. You will learn how to part the veil between heaven and earth, how to ask for God angels to attend you, and how better to receive direction from heaven. Your diligent efforts to do so will reinforce and strengthen your spiritual foundation. Then he talked about how after the renovations of the Salt Lake Temple are completed, it will be the safest place during an earthquake. And then he said this: likewise, whenever any kind of upheaval occurs in your life, the safest place to be spiritually is living inside your temple covenants. There is an exclamation point at the end of that sentence. Whenever the prophet uses an exclamation point, I pay attention. So in my personal notes from reading this talk, I wrote in the margins, what does it mean to me to live inside my temple covenants? My answer is a work in progress, but what I have thought about the most is what I learned about the temple and my covenants during the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, whenever I had a tough situation or a question or needed any kind of guidance, I ran to the temple. I am fortunate enough to live 15 minutes away from 2 different temples, so it is really easy for me to go. Then the temples were shut down and I no longer had the option to run to the temple. During the time the temples were closed, I sought other ways to connect with the divine and had amazing spiritual experiences. I felt distinct, divine guidance and direction. I felt enveloped in love from my heavenly parents and the Savior. I had experiences that in the past I thought I could only have inside the temple. As the temple was about to open back up and I was preparing to attend again, the Spirit taught me that it wasn't my physical presence in the temple that brought about the guidance and peace and love I had felt. It was my covenants. I wanted to be back inside the temple, of course, but I knew that because I was bound to God through my covenants, I could have those spiritual experiences anywhere. I'm still pondering this question, but that is one of the answers that I have received. I am so excited to hear other women's responses. So here are the details. The recording where we will come together to answer what it means to live inside our temple covenants is taking place on Tuesday, February 15th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. If you are listening to this episode before that date and you want to come to the recording and share, please go to the show notes or to my profile on Instagram and find the link to sign up. And I want to say that I know this is a deep question, and you may be thinking to yourself, I don't know what my answer to that question is. How do I live inside my temple covenants? I want you to know that you are invited to come to the recording. I would love for everyone to share, but if you aren't sure of your answer and the date and time works for you, please still come. You might receive an answer as you listen to other women share, or being at the recording might help you start to formulate your own answer. I know that it really is a deep question, and it will probably require some thought, some work, and maybe even a wrestle to know what this means for you. And that is totally okay. And if you can't come to the live recording, I will be sharing it as a podcast episode the following week. And I know you will have the opportunity to listen and feel the Spirit and receive the answers that you need. One other thing I want to say, if you've been baptized and made that covenant, but haven't made covenants in the temple yet, or if you are not a member of the church and haven't yet made covenants, you are also invited to come to the recording. Don't hesitate to sign up if you feel like you should come. And please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to explain more about covenants and share more of my personal experience of how covenants have helped me in my life and how they have bound me to God. So really, everyone is invited. Please come. I'm so looking forward to this. I really can't wait for it. And if you're listening to this episode after that recording date, then look for the episode to come out with the recording, with everybody sharing on there, and go and listen to that one as well. So I hope that this episode helps you and that attending or listening to the upcoming group episode will help you as well. I want you to know I am praying for you and I am cheering you on, and I will see you next week. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, please share it with a friend. I would love it if you would leave a review and rate it on Apple Podcasts. This actually helps more women find the podcast and embrace their own journey on the covenant path. To find more ways to be a part of the Spiritually Minded Women community, head over to spirituallymindedwomen.com. For more inspiration, follow along on Instagram @spirituallymindedwomen. Have an amazing day. I'm cheering you on in your journey.